again, and welcome to this morning's Amani Africa Forum, where we will be looking and talking about the resurgence of unconstitutional change of governments in Africa. My name is Shuvai Nyoni, and it is my pleasure to moderate the session this morning. And thank you very much to Amani Africa for the invitation to join you this morning. This morning, we will be discussing, as I've said, the resurgence of unconstitutional change of governments in Africa, given many of the events that have been taking place across the continent. Let me begin, for those of you who may not be very familiar, and for those of you who do know, just with a bit of a reminder about the organization that has brought us together this morning, Amani Africa. Amani Africa is an independent Pan-African policy research, training and consulting think tank with expertise on the African Union system and a specialization on the African Union Peace and Security Council. The Amani Africa intends and makes every effort to lead from the perspective of evidence-based policy-oriented knowledge generation on the African Union and other regional bodies. And I really want us to make sure that we are appreciative of the role that such institutions are playing on our continent, especially when it comes to knowledge generation and cutting edge knowledge generation and capacity development on the issues that, that concern us as a continent. This morning, we will have with us a number of speakers who will be assisting us as we navigate this subject of the resurgence of unconstitutional change of governments. And our speakers this morning include the director of the founding director of Amani Africa Media and Research Services, Dr. Solomon Durso. Dr. Solomon Durso is also a commissioner of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And he will be joined by Professor Eddie Maloka, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the African Peer Review Mechanism. We will also later be joined by Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, who's currently a distinguished professor at Wits University and former director of International IDEA. These three individuals are very well versed with the subject we're talking about, including other issues. So we really look forward to quite a fiery debate. And I'll give a little bit more of an extended introduction to each of them as they join us to speak. Towards the end of our time together, we will also have a presentation of a paper, a research paper developed by Amani Africa on the very subject that we are discussing. But before I go too far, allow me to just say a few words about what has brought us together today. We all know that the African Union has measures in place to deal with the kind of activity we've been seeing on our continent. But I think a number of questions, we will need to answer a number of questions as we navigate today, and that is what the gaps are in what has been proposed, in what exists to prevent these unconstitutional changes of government. And the questions that societies are asking when we see them cheering and celebrating some of these unconstitutional changes that we have been seeing. But it is not for me to go into too much detail on that, but allow me please to invite Dr. Solomon Durso, as I've said, the founding director of Amani Africa Media and Research Services and commissioner of the African Union on Human and People's Rights from November 2015 to date. Dr. Durso, as many of you know, is a prominent peace, security, and legal scholar with many years of teaching, research, and consulting experience across the continent on issues of political science, peace, and security and governance issues. Dr. Durso also happens to be a mentor and a friend of the African Leadership Center where I am based. So Solomon, over to you, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shuvai, for that very generous introduction. And I would also like to thank you, Shuvai. Shuvai Nyoni is the executive director of the Africa Leadership Center. This is a premier organization that is engaged in capacity development, research, and also importantly in the mentorship of the new leaders of Africa on policy research and practice on peace and security issues on our continent. I would like to thank Shuvai for joining us this morning. A very good morning or good afternoon to all of you from wherever you have joined us this morning. It is a great pleasure for us at Amani Africa to once again have a very distinguished panel of experts who are very well known in their areas of work, joining us this morning to discuss a very timely and topical issue on the governance and peace and security scene of the African continent. I am particularly grateful to Professor Eddie Maloka, the CEO of the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, which is one of the most important African Union bodies that is engaged in the promotion of the African Union governance instruments, including with respect to constitutionalism and rule of law. So it is with great interest that I look forward to hearing from Prof. Maloka. I also wish to thank Prof. Adebayo Olukoshi, who would be joining us around 11 East African time, who, as Shuvai mentioned, it also have been a prominent scholar and policy practitioner on the African continent for quite a long period of time. Like Prof. Maloka, he is a mentor and also a great example for many of us who have been following on their footsteps. So I also look forward to his interventions. And they bring to us a wealth of knowledge, particularly in terms of putting things in a historical perspective. Because today, as Shuvai mentioned, we have witnessed in the course of 2021 three military seizures of power in 1 year. Actually, it may be said it's not even in 1 year. It's in a matter of half a year that these events happened. And that obviously has sent alarm across the continent on whether or not we are witnessing a potential return back to the time of the old days of the Organization of African Unity, when military coups and other forms of unconstitutional change of government were the means through which change of leadership has been happening. And we thought, and rightly so, following the introduction of the AU norm on unconstitutional change of government, that this mechanism of bringing about change of leadership has become history, and that we are on a sustainable path of bringing about change of leadership, not through the barrel of the gun, but through the ballot box. And here we are today discussing about whether indeed we are witnessing a reversal of the gains that have been achieved over the years, particularly since the 1990s, and indeed, most importantly, since the introduction in late 1990s and early 2000s of the African Union norm banning unconstitutional change of government. First, through the adoption of the Lome Declaration on unconstitutional change of government of 2000. Later on, the incorporation of this ban on unconstitutional change of government in the grand AU norm, which is the founding instrument of the AU, the Constitutive Act of the African Union. And later on, with the adoption of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, which provided in detail the circumstances that constitute unconstitutional change of government. And indeed, for over a decade, we have seen a largely consistent practice having emerged through the effective implementation of these norms, particularly by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, which is the premier body and indeed the standing decision-making body of the African Union on matters of peace and security, which under Article 7 of the protocol establishing it, is empowered to take measures for enforcing unconstitutional change of government, including through suspending member states that have experienced unconstitutional change of government. So it is with a great deal of expectation that today we ask a number of questions with a view to understand why we have and we are experiencing the recent resurgence, in particular, of military coups, but also certain the conditions that have led to the emergence of the resurgence of military coups, because the two can't be separated from each other. If you go and have a look at the Lomé Declaration, as far as the year 2000, it was clear in stating that failure to uphold democratic principles and constitutionalism may occasion the occurrence of the events that we have come to witness in the course of this year. So why are we witnessing these developments, and what do they tell us about the state of implementation of the AU norms on constitutionalism, rule of law, and principles of democratic governance? I wouldn't preempt the rich interventions that we are going to have, but all that I would note is the fact that the Peace and Security Council of the African Union have quite on a number of occasions acknowledged and indeed highlighted that we are experiencing challenge in terms of the effective implementation and respect for the AU norms relating to democratic principles, constitutional governance, and constitutionalism. As recently as, for example, the 10th of September, when the PAC held its session on the military coup in Guinea, it clearly indicated that we are in a time that is of concern as far as respect for the principles and constitutional rules are concerned. So the question is, what are the gaps? Are there gaps in the norms relating to the ban on unconstitutional change of government? What gaps do we also witness as far as the implementation and effective enforcement of these norms? What corrective measures, if any, need to be taken, both at the level of strengthening the norms of unconstitutional change of government, but also the implementation of these norms? And what role do institutions such as the African Peer Review Mechanism and civil society organizations like ours stand to play and should play? These are some of the questions that we will be addressing, cognizant of the fact that the PAC itself had requested and highlighted the need for a comprehensive analysis of the gaps and measures that need to be taken to reinforce the AU norm on unconstitutional change of government. I once again wish to thank each and every one of you for joining us this morning and look forward to your active participation. Thank you very much, Shubai. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Solomon, Dr. Solomon Durso, my brother, colleague, and friend. Thank you, as usual, for complicating the conversation before it even begins. But I think that is what we are here for, and I know certainly that Professor Maloka is up to the task. Allow me to just, as I introduce Professor Maloka, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the African Peer Review Mechanism. He has been the CEO since 2016. He's also a former special advisor to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation for the Republic of South Africa. And he has served South Africa's special representative to the Great Lakes region and has been a special advisor to the Deputy President of South Africa, amongst other posts. So we certainly have someone in our midst who is well placed, well versed, well experienced, I think, to share on some of these questions, but also to give us a very pragmatic view, I think, and to share with us about the state of our continent as it is and not as it ought to be, which I suspect even this particular norm on unconstitutional change of government was how it was designed. So Professor Maloka, before I ask you to speak, I just want to share a story that maybe you will also reflect on. In 2017, I received a phone call from my mother. I come from Zimbabwe, and I received a phone call from my mother who was jubilating, and there was a lot of noise in the background. She was in a crowd of people who were marching alongside the military in Zimbabwe after our assisted or non-coup that took place in that country. My mom was very surprised that I was very unemotional and a bit apprehensive of what was happening. And the one thing she said to me was, how can you not be demonstrating any kind of emotion? This has never happened in your lifetime. When you were born, this particular individual was in power, and now finally, he has, after 37 years, he is leaving power. So I just want to add that to the many complex questions that Dr. Solomon has posed to us. So Professor Maloka, over to you, sir.
No, thank you very much, my dear sister, our chair, my sister Shuvai Nyoni, the executive director of the Leadership Center. You have posed a very difficult question, so my intention is not to answer your question, but also to ask my own questions as well. Perhaps collectively, towards the end of this day, we could move towards some, perhaps a better understanding. We may not find a 100% solution, but I also look forward to the presentation of a document or a proposal or some ideas or a paper by Amani Center, the Africa Center, our host, that I thank for inviting me, and I also in particular my dear brother Solomon Durso, with whom we have worked so many years, and has a very distinguished career in matters of our continent or on matters of our continent. And of course, he was also the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And so we at the APRM, we work with him quite a lot. So I'm quite happy that also, and he made some remarks, and I was saying to him, why are you inviting us when you to come and talk about a subject you know so well? He wrote a paper himself on this subject quite a number of years ago, and he has repeated some of his arguments that are in this paper. He has repeated them in his opening presentation. And of course, I look forward also to be joined by my dear friend, Professor Olukoshi, Adebayo Olukoshi. So we are most certainly going to have a very interesting exchange, Madam Chair. Africa is experiencing this resurgence, but for me, this is a second resurgence of unconstitutional change of government, because remember that with Sierra Leone coup of 1997, that was regarded as the resurgence. Then if you look at contemporary reports, and you look at, of course, around that, we also had the summit of the African Union, of the OAU at that time in Harare in 1997. It was, they were using the same formulation, that this resurgence, because they were referring to the period of the 1980s and earlier when coups were quite common. And now they were now experiencing a resurgence. So we should say now that really we're experiencing a second resurgence of this unconstitutional or instances of unconstitutional change of government. And of course, as you know, the Sierra Leone coup, the reaction of the OAU when it met in Harare. And then after 2 years later, we had the Algiers summit, which took a very strong decision on unconstitutional change of government. And that decision then culminated in the Lomé Declaration of 2000, And those were key moments because the Algiers summit it took place in 1999. Africans were looking at themselves and say, what is it that is different that we must do in the new century? So they were preparing themselves for the 2000s, and they even adopted a macro declaration of the challenges and facing our continent and what our continent should do in the new century. And putting an end to unconstitutional change of government was one of the commitments that the leaders made at the time. And the Loma Declaration, of course, it took this decision, but at the same time, it was really you could say the birthplace of what will later become the OAU and African Union and so on. So it was also a turning point of some sort because leaders then we had had CIRT already, I think, by then. So it was really a moment of change in Africa during that period when our leaders were thinking about what they must do about unconstitutional change of government. One thing they were clear about is that we should not go back to what used to happen. We should put an end to this. So since then we achieved quite a number of things, and I think my brother also spoke to them. But I just want to say the first one, of course, is he calls it the African norm, that we're able to construct an African norm on unconstitutional change of government. And I would like to frame it and to reframe it as an African jurisprudence, regional jurisprudence on unconstitutional change of government since the Loma Declaration, and standing on three pillars. One is the Constitutive Act of the African Union. The second pillar is the Protocol of the African Union, Protocol on Peace and Security, establishing the Peace and Security Council. And then the third one is the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and so on, the ACDEC, known as ACDEC. So we have developed this, and then there are subsidiary, or you could say subsidiary streams coming out of this regional jurisprudence on unconstitutional change of government. The second thing is that we have also now established by now, you could say regional mechanisms, I want to call them mechanisms, to respond to enable our continent to deal with this challenge of unconstitutional, where we have the African Peace and Security Architecture. In it, we have the Peace and Security Council, we have the Panel of the Wise, we have the African Standby Force, I think, and then the early warning element. And then we have the regional economic communities. They play a key role, especially we have seen how ECOWAS, the role of ECOWAS in this regard. And then we have what I can generally refer to as other African Union organs. I wish to refer here to the Banjul Commission, the one that my brother Durso chaired, that because it's also mentioned in the in the Peace and Security Council protocol established in the Peace and Security Council, and then the African peer review mechanism where I work, and of course the African Court, the one in Arusha, and so on. So you could say we have a regional mechanism, an institutional infrastructure of all these regional bodies that are there to support. Some of them were brought into being by this jurisprudence, but that are there to support, to ensure that the continent, at least at the regional level, responds to outbreaks of unconstitutional change of government. And then the third issue for me, which is very important, and I'll return to an element of it later, is that we have a continental consensus on constitutionalism, elections, and of course, this sense of dialectical link that we think exists between governance, governance, development, and peace and security, that we need the three together to work together and dialectically reinforcing. So even the perpetrators of coups and all, they themselves want to define themselves within this consensus. So they are not doing it with impunity. So they want to justify their actions, and they're able to say, no, we did this, and they try to define themselves within the frame of this consensus. So these three things for me, I think, are the things that we should not undermine: the jurisprudence, the regional mechanisms, and then the continental consensus. But where are the challenges? And then I think we know them, but I just want to mention quite a few of them and perhaps make some suggestions as to how we can. The first one is what I believe to be an unresolved tension between what constitutes unconstitutional change of government and what we call popular uprisings. I want to read to you very briefly a contemporary news report of the coup in Sierra Leone. This is a newspaper clip of dated May 28 May 1997, and then he talks about it was preparations for the Harare summit of the OAU, And then the terrorists, the Organization of African Unity officials said in Harare on Wednesday that they are opposed to the presence of any delegation from the military junta in Sierra Leone at this year's summit. And our dear and departed elder brother, Dr. Ibrahim Dagash, was the spokesperson at the time, and then he's quoted, and then the junta overthrew the legitimate government against the wishes of the people, and who in 1996 decided at the ballot and not the bullet that they would govern. So this is Dagash speaking. He said that the delegation sent by the legitimate government of Sierra Leone to the meeting of the OAU Committee of Ambassadors will continue to represent the country, but not the delegation of the mutinous soldiers. And then the OAU Committee on Conflict Prevention, Management and Resolution on Monday condemned the coup d'etat against President Ahmad Tejakeba, describing it as a setback, not only to the people of Sierra, but also to the people. But then the issue says, meanwhile, Dagash said, that's the story, the OAU is ready to welcome a delegation from the new government of the Democratic Republic of Congo at Wednesday's session of the OAU Council and at the summit. OAU looks forward to welcoming the late Lawrence Kabila to introduce himself to his peers, he said. The OAU has already recognized the government of Kabila, whose alliance of democratic forces for the liberation of Congo seized power in Kinshasa 2 weeks ago, ending 32 years of military rule by the ailing president Mobutu Sese Seko. This is a report, and then here it's a complementing report. This one is dated 3 months later, July 1997. It also talks about the same incident. It talks about the African Union, the Organization of African Unity having met in June to at the 33rd summit of the Organization of African Unity, which is the OAU. They welcome progress towards achieving peace in a number of countries, and then so on. And then it cites Kofi Annan, of course, and then he's condemning and talking about, and then he says, Kofi Annan, where democracy has been usurped, let us do all in our power to restore it to the people. The UN Secretary General Kofi Annan at the summit's opening. And then he further continued and said, neighboring states, regional groups, and international organizations must all play their part to restore Sierra Leone's constitutional democratic government. And then it also quotes your president, former president, unfortunately late now, His Excellency President Robert Mugabe. And then it says, because he was the chair, he said, democracy must be restored in Sierra Leone as a matter of urgency. Mugabe said, the new OAU chairman. We are getting tougher and tougher on coups, said Mugabe. Coup plotters and those who overthrow democratic governments will find it more difficult to get recognition from us. Democracy is getting stronger in Africa, and we must now have a definite attitude against coups. So it quotes President Mugabe at that time, and I close the quote. But then he then says that that events in Sierra Leone may have stolen the thunder from the other issues at the OAU summit opening, but Africa's leaders did give a rousing welcome to Congolese President Laurent Kabila, their newest colleague. So this is the same summit, and it takes a different posture to similar. You could not similar. Here you had an uprising, you had a Mobutu overthrown, and then here you have a coup, and then the coup plotters are rejected, and then the late President Laurent Kabila is given a rousing welcome by the summit. So this unresolved issue of in the AU approach to what unconstitutional change of government and what it calls a popular uprising. I know it's a hot potato, but we have to deal with it once and for all. And then we also saw it with the Arab Spring of 2011, where the Peace and Security Council took a positive posture towards events that were happening in that part of our continent. So it leads to policy, you could say, to uncertainty, to confusion. And then in many cases, it also relies on, it's also affected by the geopolitics, because in some instances, if a country is very strong, can stand its ground, then certain things can happen. When if it's not, and so on and so on. So it creates a gap that we need to address. And I want to make some suggestions later. The second one is the weakness in the African in the regional jurisprudence that I referred to earlier. these instruments, including the Constitutive Act of the African Union, they are not legally binding. They depend on the political will of member states. My view is that we need to start moving as a continent towards a legally binding regional instrument that can be domesticated as national law or international law, the same way that many of our member states have domesticated the International Criminal Court statute through national law. And it's a you know, you live in South Africa here, you're following President Zuma's court cases, and he's trying to invoke international law, but that has not been domesticated through domestic law. So it's the same situation that we have with all these instruments we have across the continent, that they are there, but they depend on the political will. So the very pillars of this jurisprudence on unconstitutional change of government depend on political will. The Constitutive Act depends on political. They have not been domesticated. Member states are not required to domesticate. The ACDEC, the charter, there is a provision for member states to domesticate it, but member states don't do it. And I'll come back a little bit later to it. So this jurisprudence is not legally binding on member states. And dependence on, it's dependent on political will, or sole dependence on political will is not working. It's something that we have to deal with. The second thing about the weakness of this jurisprudence is that our instruments are scattered all over the show. We need to consolidate all these instruments into a composite AU legal document that is binding on member states. So you have some sort of a Tower of Babel. You know, we have all these multiple instruments. You have the PSC, you have the protocol, you have the constitution, you have other, they repeat each other, others they do other things, and so on and so on. So we really need to deal with that. And I don't want to refer to the example of Europe, but the Europeans got to a stage and they had to do it, because as the institution grows, as our body grows, we generate all these instruments. We have to consolidate them at some point and put them into a composite document or a treaty on something. So when you have all of them, it becomes a problem. So we are able to really utilize them and deploy them as a legal force. And there are issues on the, if you look at the ACDEC and the PSC protocol, the ACDEC contains new and additional provisions, and I'll go just to chapter 8 of the ACDEC. For example, under sanctions in cases of unconstitutional changes of government, it takes the definition of unconstitutional change of government from the Lome Declaration, the four that we know: the coup, the military coup, mercenaries, rebels, and refusal by the incumbent to leave power after losing an election. Then it adds a fifth one. It says any amendment or revision of the constitution or legal instruments which is an infringement of the principle of democracy. So this is a new thing. So it's something new. And then it goes further under Article 25. Then it talks about the implementation of these measures. Then among others, it says the perpetrators of unconstitutional change of government shall not be allowed to participate in elections held to restore the democratic order. And then it says perpetrators of unconstitutional change of government may also be tried before a competent court, and so on and so on. So here you have the charter, you have the protocol. I think that what we should have done, as we are introducing this charter, we should have also amended the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council, because these measures are not in the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council. And when member states, the Peace and Security Council responds to instances of unconstitutional change of government, their base document is the protocol. And that's why I'm of the view that we need to get to a stage where we consolidate all these instruments into a composite legal instrument that is legally binding, so we don't have bits and pieces scattered all over the show, because implementation becomes difficult, enforcement becomes difficult for the agencies that are concerned. And for me, the big problem, and a much bigger problem with ACDEC, I was involved with ACDEC at the beginning. I remember that we started working on it during the transition from the OAU to the AU, when they were setting up a new commission. Ambassador Mfasoni was the acting director for political affairs, the director for, and then he set up an expert group. I was there with Professor Nzongola and a few other people. We started the process, but I was not there when it continued. But what I know that we did, my colleagues did at that time, because the big problem in the AU that we have has always been entry into force of instruments. And I know that we had amendments done to the Constitutive Act on the diaspora and so on and so on, but member states never ratified them. And I think even up to today. So there is this fear among practitioners in the system that when you come up with an instrument, member states are not going to ratify it. And people, we fear ratification. We want entry into force through a decision. We don't want it to go into ratification. We know it will die. But what we did was done here by my colleagues, and I know I was in the environment, I was not part of this. They lowered the bar for accession. You see, the accession for a number of instruments, I think, is 2/3 majority and so. But in this case, they reduced the bar to 15 member states. And I remember we thought it was an achievement, but this is the weakness of this charter. I don't know how many countries have acceded to it now. But the problem is that when you have 15 member states acceding, you are bound to have a problem with not just with the enforcement, but even with the ownership and the domestication and the implementation of the charter. So the charter is there, but the ownership is very poor. Implementation is very poor. Member states don't identify. They refer to it in their broad statements and so on and so on. But its key elements have not been enforced. I mean, it's a very good document. It talks about legislative instruments at country level to domestic. It makes all these things, but it's not owned. Even the reporting by member states doesn't happen. I know it's a big issue. And I think it's a question of how we did the charter, where we did it. We wanted it to enter into force quickly. We're interested in a decision, but not necessarily in the domestication. And I think it's something that we need to look at as we move forward, how we make sure that this ACDEC, I know it's a big issue in Addis with AGA and so on, but the ACDEC is a very, very good comprehensive document, but we need to see how then we use this and how we take it forward. And then the last point around the weaknesses in the regional jurisprudence is that we have no referral or an arbitration mechanism. You know that the Constitutive Act of the African Union provides for the Court of Justice. So we have 3 courts provided for somehow in our system. We have the court under Durso's charter, the African Court on Human and People's Rights. It's in Arusha. Then there was this whole discussion about the a court in Africa to deal with international crimes, more like an ICC equivalent, regional equivalent. Then we had another, so we added it to this court. Now the Court of Justice, it was approved, there is a protocol establishing it, but instead of establishing it, then we then said, no, it must also be included. Perhaps, I don't know how, maybe as a third chamber at the court in Arusha. And I think it's a big mistake we have made there. We really have to establish a Court of Justice. I know us who are at the organs, when we have issues of dispute, there is no referral mechanism. So even in these instruments, when you have all these multiple, somehow even conflicting instruments, there is no referral, there is no interpretive body, there is no arbitration body. So it's a weakness in our jurisprudence that we need to refer. So even when the charter says these people must be referred to a court, we don't have such a mechanism and except this African court in Arusha, but that African court in Arusha is framed differently. And even its own jurisdiction within member states is quite limited. There are all those challenges. But I think that we really need a referral and arbitration and an interpretive body within the system to be able to help us to be able to implement our instruments and to enforce them. We don't have that and so on. It's some sort of a legal Tower of Babel for us. All these instruments speaking different things. We don't have a mediating authority. So really, this is the weakness around the African jurisprudence. Then there are challenges with our regional mechanisms. And then the panel of the wise, I work in the system. I know that the panel of the wise is quite difficult there. I don't know, maybe Durso knows much better on the panel of the wise. I know that over the last few years, its visibility has not been at the level that many of us expected. So it has a big role given to it in the peace and security protocol, especially mediation, prevention, and so on. And if it's not physically and institutionally strong or present, then we are missing something. It's something that we have to look at, but it's something, it falls under the ABSA. I know that my colleague and my brother, the new commissioner for APSA now, Ambassador Bankole, is going to give serious attention to make sure that the panel of the wise is elevated, is operationalized fully and elevated at the level that it should be and given, and not given, but really it has a big role to play, and it's something that we really have to give serious consider attention to. But I trust my brother is doing. We in the APRM, we have the APRM panel of eminent persons, and we've been reaching out to the panel of the wise, and it's something that is it's a body that is important. And then the African Standby Force. I think the African Standby Force, we've done quite a lot of work formally, and even member states have taken the necessary measures in terms of the roadmap. The issues around here have always been about the rapid deployment of such a force. And SADC now, we just had an experience now with the events in Mozambique, and ECOWAS, they are much more experienced. They have also been, they have dealt with it. But the issue here is not just to have a standby force, but this standby force must be deployable rapidly. And I remember a couple of years ago when we were in the Foreign Service, we tried to create not a parallel or a subsidiary body to the standby force, ASIRC, we call it ASIRC, African Capacity something, because we were worried that foreign powers were coming into the continent and intervening quicker than we could do. And then it was really taking us back to the period of colonial intervention on our coast. So we wanted the AU to respond quick. But this is an outstanding issue of rapidity and the rapid deployment of this capability that already exists formally. And then the early warning is there, and the APRM, of course, we have the early warning center in Addis and so on. But early warning has to be early warning. But early warning needs to be complemented by like other assets like the panel of the wise, the standby force, and so on. And then there's the issue of coordination. The Banjul court, we work very well with the Banjul court and so on. And I know Ambassador Bankole is working very hard now to make sure that there's coordination between the African peace and security architecture and the African governance architecture, because the governance architecture has a preventive role, has an early warning role, plays an early warning role. You are able, because these issues of coups and all of that, we can see them about to happen, like Durso was saying, but we are not able to intervene quick enough to make sure that we prevent them. And then, of course, the regional economic communities. The regional economic communities, I think some are very strong and some are relatively weak. And there are regions where their RECs are very, very, I mean, ECOWAS, in my view, is probably the best experience, best practice in terms of its rapidity of deployment of its force, and how quick it acts and it deals with some of these instances. So the issues around institutional capacity, rapid response, and of course the regional geopolitical dynamics among the member states in the REC itself, they tend to affect how you respond to an instance of unconstitutional change of government in the region. So we really need to, the issues of the RECs, and but I think we have done quite a lot of work, the harmonization between the synchronization of the RECs and the PSC. I think there's been quite a lot of improvement. Actually, it's an area where I can say we're doing quite good. But then some RECs are doing better than other RECs, and it's something that we have to look at. The next challenge is really to review the AU sanctions regime. I think that the AU sanctions regime, I get a sense that now with this second resurgence, we're experiencing a Delta variant of COVID-19, where we know the virus exists. It's 1 year old. It's now used to the human immune system, how it responds. It's now able now to sidestep and to play and to outmaneuver the immune system, the vaccines. And so we are in that situation where the response of the AU and the RECs to unconstitutional change of government, perhaps we need to inject maybe more teeth, more creativity, because it looks like now people are able to say, I'll stage a coup, and then of course they'll probably close this road, close that airport, and then after 18 months, then this thing is over. And I think that we are in that situation of the Delta variant, and we need to look at, to review our AU sanctions regime and to see how we can make sure that the virus, even though it tries to adapt to our immune system, that it doesn't get away with it. So it's something that we need to look at, and I don't want to go into details, but I think one of the things is perhaps even much better coordination with the United Nations Security Council and then the external powers, because external powers, there are sanctions, they are bilateral. In fact, there are sanctions, national sanctions regime. Some of them, they are very, very strong, and they have a deterrence impact if they are mobilized and diplomat. So if you had the AU sanctions regime combined with the UN sanctions and some global powers, and they also impose their own sanctions, bilateral sanctions on the perpetrators, I think it's one of the possibilities that we should look at. And then the next issue really around the challenge is the balance we need between the sovereignty that member states have in terms to amend their own constitution, because the AU has no authority in terms of our current dispensation to stop a member state from changing its own constitution, because the AU is created by these member states. Each of these member states is a sovereign entity with its own constitution, its own laws. And then within its own borders, these member states can do certain things. But then there are provisions, 1 or 2 articles in the Constitutive Act that says, no, but in instances of unconstitutional change of government, we can intervene. And then maybe in instances of when there are cases of commission of international crimes, we can intervene. Member states can also, but that's almost about it. So, but then countries now, they have sovereignty in deciding their own constitutions. But then what happens when a country changes its constitution in a manner that constitution is changed in a manner that it creates instability in that country? And I think it's something that we have not been able to deal with it because we see, and theoretically and even legally, the amendment of constitution fall within the sovereign domain of our member states. But some member states amend the constitution with the intention to prolong their stay in power. And then it leads to tension and conflict within the country. And then we can see that happening. And then the aggrieved parties, then they lose an election. Maybe there's even a very poor voter turnout. The aggrieved parties, then they lose confidence in the legal and the constitutional route. Then they resort to unconstitutional path to power. So it's an issue we have to deal with. Because even when we do the elections, I participated in a number of election observer missions. When we do election observer missions, be it at the level of the AU, of the regional economic communities, our baseline are the national laws. So when we look at, let's say, your own country, when we look at the Zimbabwe, we look at the electoral law of Zimbabwe, we look at the constitution of Zimbabwe, and then we look at whether the parties and the actors are acting, even the institutions are acting in compliance with these laws. And then it is in our report that we make recommendations. Then we can say you need to improve your law. It's not giving enough freedom to the media. So it is in the record. But when we judge you on the basis of your laws. And then only in the recommendations of our report, we make recommendations. But there is no follow-up that we do to go back to the countries to assist the countries in looking at the recommendations that came out of their election observer missions. And then you go to another election, you still use the same act, you still use the same constitution. And so I think it's something that we need to look at here, this loophole in this issue about the sovereignty of states with regard to their constitution and so on, and the extent to which the AU as a regional body can play a role there. And then the other one is what
my apologies for interrupting you, but can I ask you to just wind up our time?
No, I'm about to conclude. The other issue is the one that Durso was talking about the popular uprising. I think that once we go the route that says that you can have an election and lose, maybe the elections were rigged, I don't know, maybe they were rigged, but you have the election AU observer mission teams, you have the REC observer mission, you lose, maybe the voter turnout was low, but there was an election. and then tomorrow, then the loser then takes power through popular uprising. I think we're going the wrong route. I think that we must have a consensus and agree on the principle of democratic entry and democratic exit. So if you lost in an election and that election has been endorsed by all these observer teams, I think that the losers must wait and see through the electoral cycle and not resort to popular uprising. And sometimes the way we determine popular uprising and its legitimacy is the number of people that these leaders can mobilize into the streets. And the numbers, they mean nothing, because in some countries, the divisions among the parties can be 45, 40. So you can have millions of people. So in the same way that you can have millions voting for the one in power, you can also mobilize millions campaigning and demonstrating against the one in power. So I think we really need to be firm on that principle. And of course, finally, here is the issue of the global context and the role of the external forces. We cannot talk about regime change and unconstitutional change of government in Africa without invoking the role of former colonial powers and their involvement in the domestic politics of our continent, including the determination of regimes. And then the second one is, of course, the superpower rivalry that is emerging, the new Cold War that is emerging. We know what the previous Cold War, the damage it inflicted on our continent, civil wars and people dying and instability. So we should not have a repeat of that. Africa needs to take a position on that and how we're going to deal with this emerging superpower rivalry, and it's going to affect our continent. And of course, the international criminal networks, especially the drugs and you could also say even the terrorist groups and their involvement in regime change in Africa. So for me, I think these three factors also, as we try to find a solution, we have to look at it, the external, and we have to deploy our arsenal, and the AU has to be involved and to engage some of the big powers and try to have an understanding with them on these issues. Madam Chair, in conclusion, I want to say we should do a mapping of these coups, a geographic mapping, because they don't happen everywhere and anywhere in Africa. For example, for the most part we had coups all over Africa. In Southern Africa, there was only one country that was affected, was Lesotho. And it had coups twice, and both of them were instigated by the apartheid regime. But otherwise, most of Southern Africa, there were no coups. In East Africa, it's also a very something that is quite scarce. So we have to really do a geographic mapping, because once we do this geographic mapping, we are then able to unearth the anatomy of these coups and to understand better the factors that account for their resurgence or their emergence. Because the factors are domestic, are regional, and they also have an international context to them. And then I want to say that I don't believe that we are in decline. I believe that overall there's an improvement in governance in Africa. As I said, that there are certain things that we've achieved in the course of the 2000 and so on up to now. This is just a tactical retreat. It's not a strategic collapse of governance in Africa. And I still say, and this is where I want to complete my statement, is that for the 21st century, I think the AU, we need to be more pragmatic, and we need to do one basic things. We need to pull together our instruments, develop a composite instrument that is legally binding on our member states. We need to have that courage. It will be a difficult battle, but until we make sure that the commitments member states make at the continental level become domestic laws, I think we're going to have quite a big challenge. And we've seen what has happened over the last 20 years of the AU, and now we need to bite the bullet and really try that for the next 20 years or so. Madam Chair, I'm sorry I took a lot of your time, and once again, thank you very much, and to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Professor Maloka. I think that was a real tour de force through the African Union and its response to and preparation for unconstitutional changes of government. I think you have shed a lot of light on the institutions, the structures, the approaches, and also some of the history of how our leaders have responded to some of these issues with many contradictions. And I think you have added further complexity to the conversation today. So thank you very, very much. And we will come back to you when we are having discussions. There are already a number of questions and comments in the chat, some of which I think you have addressed as you have spoken. Allow me now to please welcome Professor Adebayo Olukoshi. Prof, very, very welcome to you. Karibu sana. We're very happy to have you with us today. And we're very excited to hear from you and to hear you add to the many issues that Professor Maloka has already put on the table. Allow me to introduce Professor Olukoshi. He is a distinguished professor at Wits University and also the former director of International IDEA. Professor Olukoshi has also served as a member of the AU Assessment Panel and chairs several boards of a number of think tanks. Many of you would remember him from his days at Codesria. And some of these also include the European Center for Development Policy Management, as well as the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. Prof is an eminent Pan-Africanist, a mentor, a teacher, and I think a rabble-rouser in his own way. So, Prof, you're very welcome, and you're welcome to disrupt and disorganize this forum as much as you would like. So, please, I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Shuvai. You've been more than generous in your introduction, and welcome. And I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. Thank you very much to the Amani colleagues, Solomon, and I greet all the participants, including my colleague and friend Eddie, whom I was able to catch I think in the nick of time to follow his presentation. I would want to start by saying that we've had a problem for some time on the continent with our quest for democratization. And the one way in which one can fully understand, in my view, the nature of the problem is to probably go back to the heyday of the quest itself, when the throngs of people on the streets of Cotonou, later replicated in other countries across the continent, began to make the push for an end to single-party rule. And let's not forget that that development occurred in the context of at least a decade and a half of some of the harshest structural adjustment measures that our continent had known. One might even argue that it is amongst the worst experience of austerity in the period since the Great Depression. And we might look at what the Greeks recently underwent in the context of their debt crisis and the attempt by Europe and others to enforce austerity on them. But imagine also that there was a lot of soft landing embedded in the Greek austerity program. Africa had no such possibility of a soft landing or even of some carrots infused into the structural adjustment context. It was a raw set of policies designed to retrench the state, liberalize markets, and effectively redistribute wealth, both domestically and between Africa and the rest of the world. And in the context of all of that, the movement for political change, which supposedly ushered Africa into the global third wave of democratization, manifested itself. So that one can argue, in a certain sense, that Africa's entry into that third wave of global democratization was itself the product of mass uprising, of popular protest. And it was a mass uprising which we welcomed because it was part of a broad democratic project for change. I remember that even in those countries, such as Zimbabwe, that hadn't gone fully one party, even if the intention of the Mugabe government at the time was very clear that Zimbabwe was going to go one party. There was a soft pedaling, so to speak, and a rethink, which was also partly underwritten by the constitutional change movement that grew, that emerged in Zimbabwe, driven by civil society, academics, trade unions, that kind of put a break on what looked like an inexorable march to a single party rule. Again, the product of mass participation to effectively rein in political power and drive an agenda of change. Now, that agenda of change itself was premised both on a liberal component, but also a social component. The liberal component, of course, was to open up the political space. And across Benin Republic and much of Francophone Africa, the refrain about the espace politique, décrispation, de l'espace politique, to open up the political space and set aside the rigidities of an ancien regime that had dominated power for a very long period, whether as military or in the guise of a civilian administration, but effectively anchored in military power, was very clear. Integral to that also was the set of civil liberties that had been denied the bulk of the population in the name of nation building and development. The social component was a very simple one, and it was about overcoming the adverse consequences of structural adjustment on livelihoods, individual and community livelihoods, so that effectively it was a dual project of democratization that on the one hand sought a new political empowerment in which, in the classic liberal tradition, the people will be the repository of sovereignty, and on the other hand, a social advancement that will help to claw back the losses which the generality of the people had suffered in the context of structural adjustment, austerity. And very quickly, I think we had important scores on the liberal front, which I think Eddie very well covered in his presentation. There were important scores. We saw regimes that seemed unmovable being toppled, so to speak, democratically, and an alternation of power taking place in countries where that seemed altogether impossible only a few years earlier. And even in the best performing cases, Ghana, even to some extent, Benin Republic, until recently, where it all started, we saw such routinization of voting and alternation of power that we started talking about a consolidation of democracy. We saw in many countries former heads of state being able to live in their own country and not go into exile as soon as they leave power, and take on the role of quote unquote elder statespeople, and so on and so forth. So I would not emphasize on that too much because I think it's very familiar to all of us. We saw important developments around constitutionalism and glimpses of what judicial independence could mean. We continue to even see such glimpses until now, with the ruling that emanated from the Supreme Court of Lesotho, of Malawi, for example, being a good example of that, or even again, another ruling from Kenya on the bridge initiative on top of the electoral one, again showing that there are possibilities and not all is completely lost. But we failed signally. We failed signally on the social side of things, where it became effectively the case that regardless of the governments that would be voted into power, the content of economic and social policy did not actually change. And that's precisely what Nkandawire and others, myself included, have over the years referred to as the choicelessness that has confronted democracies in Africa. Africa's young democracies may appear to be getting the mechanics of the transfer of power right, but the underlying substantive questions that are central to the empowerment of the people as citizens actively engaged in the governance of their own affairs is completely lacking, and it does not matter who is voted into power. Austerity continues, restrictive social policy continues, and the fallout of that effectively is a gradual strengthening of executive power. What Peter Nyong'o, who should know as a governor of one of the counties in Kenya, Peter Nyong'o referred to as the revival of presidentialism in many of our countries. And the interconnection between the liberal and the social components of the transition effectively created a situation in which people voted but did not appear to choose. And in consequence, we had a fallout that refracted itself into the imperative for those who hold power to seek to concentrate that power only for the purpose of regime survival. Only for the purpose of regime survival. And few are those governments that have been voted in the context of the alternations which we have seen, that have made a significant investment in strengthening democratic institutions that propelled them into power as a prime agenda of policy and politics. Few, very few. The instinct in the context of the social dislocations in most of our democratizing countries, and of the loss, therefore, of the trust between state and society, of the inability to rebuild a social contract between government and citizen, has been effectively to retreat into the bunker and concentrate power. And so that governance, even under alternated power, has tended to be about wrong-footing the citizenry and closing loopholes in the political and constitutional instruments that might enable citizens to call government to account. I'm sorry, that's the way I read it. You know, and that's how you can understand. I'm not working for any intergovernmental organization anymore, so I can afford to be very direct and brutally frank on this. That's why you can understand Patrice Talon, who goes in there and makes his primary purpose how to kill opposition, and becomes a president of a politics of anti-politics, a president of politics of anti-politics, runs as an independent candidate, and then creates instruments that they call political parties that basically support and reinforce his power. And it's also within that logic, in my view, that we can begin to also understand the questions around the amendment of constitutions that we have seen. So what I'm trying to say is that the failing at the level of the social refracts itself into the arena of the liberal underlying principles of the transition in such a way that they undermine those liberal components. And effectively, in most countries, what should be the normal channel for change is effectively foreclosed. And the only way you can achieve change is either to take to the streets or appeal to the barracks, or both. And I am afraid that in many countries, in too many countries, on our continent today, we are in that situation. So much, I think, brought out also, even exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which effectively has shown the nakedness of our democratic transition and all of its discontents in full, of the effective collapse of a social bargain that has fed an ethnocentric identity-making process, which in turn makes intolerance a growing part of the culture of politics, and therefore the idea of a winner takes all, the opposition be damned mentality back in the citadels of power. Now, if you are in that kind of situation, how are you going to organize for change? You are not going to appeal to a constitution which an Alpha Conde will wake up in his second term, realizing that he has no other way than to declare the constitution on the basis of which he governed for almost a decade to be illegitimate because it was passed by some military junta. And he will pass a new constitution and then start afresh. We go back to year zero. Very few people are fooled by that kind of thing. And we see it repeated in other contexts. Only in a few countries is there still an adherence to that principle of term limitation, partly because to even tamper with it at all will be to invite instability of a worse proportion than what they are already confronted with in some of those countries. And I can speak of Nigeria in that regard, right? The plate is already too full with problems anyway, that you don't add an extra one by saying you want to amend the constitution. So it seems to me that we need to go back to the drawing board, and in the context of this overarching framework, the norms and the instruments that are at our disposal seem to be already outdated. They seem to be already outdated because if every forecast for the political future of the continent is taken into account, and we do so responsibly, there is no doubt that given the trends with the social indicators on the continent, we are going to see more citizen action and demand on the streets for change. We've already seen what we, in many instances, did not think was imaginable, the looting of warehouses, right? COVID-19 relief material, looted at the slightest opportunity. In the Nigerian case, it was NSAS. In the case of South Africa, it was, Jacob Zuma must be released, right, from prison. And then it snowballs into something else. And there is the seething anger, especially amongst the youth, which our both domestic constitutional frames and political processes, as well as the continental instruments and standards, do not accommodate. And it will be extremely impossible, as we saw in the case of Guinea-Conakry recently, for anybody in the name of some ECOWAS or some African Union to go to Conakry and tell the people, go back to constitutional order. Well, they were booed. They were booed on the streets of Conakry. This is not on. And, I'm not going to rule out the fact that people can buy a crowd, right? It doesn't take too much to buy a crowd and match them on the streets. But for that itself to happen in the first instance, it means that there are objective conditions on the ground that accommodate that possibility. If you have a properly functioning system, it becomes harder and more expensive to buy people and rent a crowd to do your bidding. But I'm very convinced that in the case of Conakry, the most recent of the unconstitutional changes we are speaking about, we're actually dealing with genuinely felt sentiments of people saying, when this government that was overthrown was amending the constitution, and remember, civil society in West Africa even pointed out that the original document produced by the commission that proposed amendments and the final version that President Conde signed into law had discrepancies and made representations to ECOWAS. So even the amended document was rigged further after it went through Parliament. What was signed was not what was passed in Parliament. Those elements that were deemed inconvenient were further amended unilaterally by executive power. We did not see a delegation of ECOWAS leaders go to Conakry to say to President Condé, you are out of order here. A change takes place, you begin to threaten sanction, and you say you are going to march. I think it's an invitation to the beginning of irrelevance, especially in a context in which you do not have the leverage that you think you enjoy to be able to influence the course of events. And this is, I think, a sobering invitation to all of us to step back and to sound the alarm bell to those who are still willing to listen, that the continent is changing under their noses. The continent is changing under their noses. And that change is underwritten by a demographic population, which at one level is highly globally connected and mobile. And at another level is what Frantz Fanon will refer to as your déclassés. Your déclassés who are completely alienated, reduced to the wretched of the earth, absolutely nothing to lose, available as cannon fodder to the highest bidder, including those who recruit into criminal gangs and extremist groups, offering an alternative vision of society that is not secular, that is not democratic, and that is going to go for the state houses. It's only a matter of time. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think true to form, you have you have really shaken the bottle, and I think we are in a very good place to enter into an exciting debate and conversation. And I think you have you have given us, you have added to Professor Maloka's own points and some of his own reflections and observations. I think where I'm seeing the greatest match is, Professor Maloka referred to this Delta variant of how incumbents have become very adept at navigating and getting around some of these, this so-called norm that we are discussing. And I think you have really painted it very blatantly for what it is. And this distance, this gap, especially around the social policy and the social question. So thank you very much, Prof. There's so much there. I will not try to delve deeper into it, but allow me, before we go into discussions, to invite Sion Hagos from Amani Africa, who's going to do a presentation on some of the research from Amani. Sion, before I ask you to start speaking, let me just remind our participants that you can use the question and answer box, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, to pose your questions when we open for discussion. You can also use the raise hand function. Also, feel free to make your comments in the chat. Sion, who is a human rights, who has a human rights background and is a researcher at Amani, please, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Shuvay. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. Thank you all once again for joining us on this webinar today. And also thanks to our speakers for this enriching discussion. As already highlighted at the beginning of this event, in addition to reflecting on the resurgence of coups in Africa, today's virtual seminar is also meant for us to, is meant to serve as an opportunity for us to launch our latest special research report on this topic. So focusing on Guinea's recent experience, this report is basically aimed at providing certain critical reflections on the challenge to AU norms which ban unconstitutional change of government, and then to recommend some means of strengthening these norms. So most of this already have been captured by our speakers. So in my presentation, I'll just try to be as brief as possible and I'll try to highlight the main findings of the report. So the first part of the report basically identifies and elaborates some of the key underlying reasons which resulted in Guinea's unconstitutional change of government. Then, having regard to these underlying reasons, the second part examines the limits to AU norms on unconstitutional change of government and the gaps in their implementation. So then it tries to highlight how these gaps are contributing to the continuity of the problem, of course. I will then wrap up the presentation with an overview of the final part of the report, which basically provides some key recommendations on how to address this identified challenge. So as we will all recall, Guinea's September 5th coup was an event which, in addition to signifying a major constitutional crisis in the country, also demonstrated the nation's political and institutional instability while also creating certain new economic uncertainties. But as importantly, and also not to be overlooked, is that it was an indication of more entrenched underlying governance problems. So in the first part of the report, we try to capture some of these key underlying reasons. And in that regard, 5 underlying reasons are identified. The first reason basically elaborates the nature of relationship between Alpha Conde's government and the people of Guinea. So as we all have witnessed, and as it was earlier mentioned as well, following the coup, we witnessed the public celebrating the failure of the government, while some opposition groups actually went to the extent of welcoming the event and viewing it as the downfall of a dictatorial regime. So such progression basically indicates that the relationship between the government and the people was already severely damaged. The second reason, which is highlighted in the report, refers to the nature of Guinea's October 2020 election. So once again, the clear lack of popular opposition against the September 5th coup was a clear indication that this election took place in a manner which was far from being fair and free. So this is also another reason which served as an underlying factor which facilitated the coup. The third underlying reason, which is identified, is the unchecked power of the executive branch of government, which impeded upon the constitutional roles assigned to the other 2 branches to limit executive authority, of course. So this was actually particularly apparent in how the Constitutional Court approved and certified the highly contested constitutional referendum, which allowed the president to run for to continue for a 3rd term in office. And the fourth reason, which is highlighted in the report, is very much connected to the third one. And this is the political instability that had gripped Guinea for about a year prior to the October 2020 election. And this was a direct result of the constitutional amendment conducted with the aim of removing this presidential term limit. And finally, the report explains how governance challenges in the security sector, particularly the lack of professionalism and the weak nature of command and control, has served as another underlying factor which laid a fertile ground for Guinea's coup to take place. So having identified these, the report stresses that like the very purpose of laying out these underlying causes is in order to better understand the factors which facilitate and set the stage for the perpetration of coups, but by no means are these reasons to justify or to be regarded as reasons for legitimizing an unconstitutional change of regime or a military power grab. So the measures that were taken by both the AU and the ECOWAS in clear condemnation of the coup and suspending Guinea from participation in the respective institutions has been appropriate and of course laudable. But the question the report then poses is, are these measures actually enough? Do they suffice, particularly having regard to the fact that this coup has been a symptom of these deeper governance issues, which we just discussed? And so on that note, the report in the second part tries to capture some of the key limitations to AU norms, which ban unconstitutional change of government, and the gaps in their enforcement as well. So in terms of AU norms, which ban unconstitutional change of government, 4 main gaps are identified in the report. The first one relates to the disconnect between such norms and the background context, which actually results in an unconstitutional change of government. So essentially what this means is that while the major underlying factors which lead to unconstitutional change of government relates to issues such as human rights violations and the lack of rule of law, as well as the proper implementation of democratic principles, we find that it is only unconstitutional change of government that AU norms actually sanction. So what this does in effect is it results in the application of norms against unconstitutional change of government in a manner which is somewhat divorced from these broader underlying issues. So having noted this gap, the report mainly recommends that sanctions which are applicable to unconstitutional change of government should also be applied in those cases of systematic and widespread violation of rule of law, as well as human rights and democratic principles. The second gap, which is addressed, relates to the lack of mechanism that deals with the phenomenon of constitutional coups. So what this means is basically, it refers to the process through which incumbent presidents extend their term limits to constitutional amendments. So as the report captures, over the last 2 decades alone, there were about 26 cases of constitutional amendments in 20 African states, resulting in the removal or loosening of presidential term limits. So despite this, there is still no specific AU norm which actually prohibits the revision or amendment of constitutions with the purpose of extending term limits. So this is not to disregard, of course, Article 23 sub 5 of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. This provision clearly regards amendments or revisions of constitutions which infringe on principles of democratic change of government as illegal means of accessing or maintaining power. But then the limitation of this provision is that it does not really per se deal with the revision or amendment of constitutional clauses on term limits. Rather, its concern is with the democratic legitimacy and the democratic nature of the process of constitutional amendments. And in addition to that, there is also no clarity on how this provision is to be enforced. So there is clearly a need to clarify how this provision can be applied, also how it can be enforced, especially having regard to how it can contribute towards resolving this issue of constitutional coups. So the third gap that is identified in the report is the lack of clarity on also how AU norms banning unconstitutional change of governments are to be applied in the cases of popular uprisings. This was particularly apparent in the cases of Egypt and Tunisia during the 2011 and 2012 popular uprisings in Northern Africa. So during these cases, the AU has been faced with the challenge of determining whether a regime change in such cases actually qualify as unconstitutional change of government. And years from then, the AU still lacks any norm that could actually offer guidance on how to navigate these cases of democratic uprisings separate from manifest cases of unconstitutional change of government. So the fourth and last gap, which is identified, is the lack of clarity on what conditions ought to be met in order to establish that constitutional order has been restored in a member state which has already been sanctioned for unconstitutional change of government. This is particularly, it has been observed since in some cases sanctions imposed against a member state for coups have been lifted prior to the holding of elections and prior to the formation of a new government. So while these four gaps I just elaborated relate to limitations in AU norms on unconstitutional change of government, the report also further identifies two gaps relating to the implementation of these norms. So the first gap is the inconsistency and policy divergence between the practice of the AU and relevant RECs, or regional economic communities, as a result of the lack of clear standards on restoration of constitutional order. So this one directly relates with the gap in norms that I just elaborated earlier. So this gap is specifically observed in those cases where particular RECs would decide to lift the sanctions that they have imposed against the member states for unconstitutional change of government, while the AU chooses to actually uphold those that it has imposed. The other gap relating to implementation is the lack of consistency in the application of the well-established norm, which which bans coup makers from participating in elections so that they can automatically legitimize their militarily seized power. So there is also a need to make sure that this norm is consistently implemented throughout all the cases. So having identified the underlying cases of coups as exemplified in the case of Guinea, and also having elaborated the gaps in AU norms, which ban unconstitutional change of government and their implementation, the report concludes by emphasizing the following main points. First, it draws attention to how AU norms against coups seem to be perceived by coup perpetrators. And in that regard, three main observations are made. The first is that perpetrators of coups are growingly showing little regard to this norm, and they seem to be unafraid of bearing its consequences. And second, these perpetrators are also recognizing how the AU and RECs are being somewhat lenient in their enforcement of norms banning unconstitutional change of government. And also finally, militaries are clearly willing and seem to be ready to manipulate the inability of norms on unconstitutional change of government to address governance issues. Another important point, which is emphasized as a concluding remark, is how Guinea's events are indicative of the weakness of early warning mechanisms in the continent. And that is both AU and ECOWAS, in the case of Guinea, for instance, could and should have perceived the constitutional disputes within the country, as well as the other governance issues we just addressed, as early warnings of an impending or a possible unconstitutional change of government. So having noted that, the report recommends that political confrontations, as well as issues relating to third termism, be made part of AU's continental early warning system. Another recommendation emanating from the report is also that the AU Peace and Security Council convenes a special retreat revolving around strengthening AU's ban against unconstitutional change of government, so as to address some of these gaps in the norms, as well as their enforcements that we have just identified. And finally, the report recommends the formation of a subsidiary experts group of the PSC on the implementation of AU norm on unconstitutional change of government. So the idea would be for this body to provide technical assistance in assessing the occurrence as well as nature of unconstitutional change of government, and also to look into the fulfillment of conditions for lifting sanctions imposed against unconstitutional change of government, as well as the restoration of constitutional order. So I will conclude this presentation by highlighting that this report is aimed at contributing to the PSC's call at this 1030 session addressing Guinea's coup for a comprehensive analysis on the root causes and impacts of unconstitutional change of government. This was also earlier highlighted by Dr. Solomon. And so yeah, thank you all very much for your attention. And of course, the report itself is now available on our website, and we will be shortly circulating the link. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Zion. And thank you, I think, especially for connecting all the strands and threads of what our our two professors and yourself and Dr. Solomon have already outlined. I find your recommendations quite interesting. And I want to, I'm wondering to myself about, the note that Professor Olukoshi left us on, reminding us of the demographic that we are faced with, who are very ready to take to the streets or do what they need to in order to make their own demands or their own interests known and heard, and how some of these recommendations would relate to that. So I know that Professor Maloka needs to leave us soon. We are now ready for our Q&A. And Prof. Maloka, before you leave, please do respond to some of the questions which have been posed. One is whether we should have been, whether you were surprised by the coup in Guinea, and if you would agree that the illegitimate modification of constitutions and breaking term limits is regarded as an unconstitutional change of government. I know you began to address that, but if you could please let us know whether you were surprised by the events in Guinea. I think another question that was directed at you was in the cases of popular uprisings, because you outlined the difference between a popular uprising and an unconstitutional change of government. So whether in these cases of popular uprisings, this would still be considered an unconstitutional change of government, since the change was not brought about through an election. So maybe you could just add to that or clarify that for Iskeda Bekele. The first question is from Desiree Asogbavi, and this second question is from Iskeda Bekele. So Prof, before you leave, if I could just pose those two questions to you. And the last question, Prof Maloka, to you is, given what Professor Olukoshi said about this demographic, what is your message to these young people who are very ready to take to the streets? You said that in an election where there are losers, the losers should wait for the next election cycle. But what would your message be to this demographic that we see across the continent that is very ready to make their voices heard in whatever ways possible? Thank you, Prof. Over to you.
My sister, thank you very much. Let me once again thank Bayo, because when I was thanking him at the beginning of this our discussion, he was not yet there. And also thank you once again, also yourself as a chair, and our host Amani, and my sister Sion for a very excellent presentation. And I look forward to, of course, educating myself with the draft that the paper that they have just shared with us. And I think some of its recommendations are quite interesting and are worth pursuing further. As to the questions that you are raising, look, it's not just the question in Guinea. We have made a lot of progress on governance in Africa, but we do have a problem across the continent in different, in different countries. We do have real serious governance challenges that we must continue to work on. But remember that there are those things that, because we work as a PRM, I'm a civil servant employed by member states to assist them, to work with them. So there are things that we can do and can contribute, but there are things that can be done better by, like Amani, think tanks, and so on. And then the youth at country level, even regional youth bodies, there are also things that they can do better than what we can achieve. Remember that in the case of regional organizations, these are creations by member states. We are created by member states and we are hired by them to assist. So we are quite limited in what we can do. We advise them, we work with them, and we work with their decisions, we work with their instruments, and we push them and so on. But political parties, youth movements don't have those kind of constraints. So I'm talking from the point of view, and my presentation really was talking from the point of view of people employed and working in these regional organizations. What is it that we can do to be able to assist our member states to move forward? And if our member states are not doing certain things, we can appeal, we can push, but we are quite constrained. So there are things that, there are real challenges on our continent with constitutions, with elections. We see that with elections. After elections, there's infighting, the state of our political parties, and after elections, also the state of our institutions, the capacity of states, and all these things are, are real. They contribute to these challenges that we have in our continent. So I don't get surprised when I see masses of people in streets expressing their anger against the government. I also don't get surprised when there's an election and there's a dispute over that election among political parties because of weaknesses in our electoral institutions, the electoral law. And so, and as I said, that when we send election observer missions, we work with national laws. And similarly, it's a point that also Sion was raising, that member states amend constitutions, and you can see it happening in countries after they have amended constitution. And Bayo also made that point. But then the AU doesn't come and work with the country and so on. And the RECs also do not come because perhaps there is no mechanism. Maybe there's no legal basis. And these are the things that these are the things that the regional bodies are unable to do, but it doesn't mean that other actors can't do. So this is what the distinction I want to make. It doesn't mean if the AU can do something, other bodies can't. So there are bodies that are much better placed to achieve certain objectives to realize certain goals in the governance, improvement of governance, that regional organizations are unable to, because regional organizations are created by member states themselves, and their employees are staff members, and work on those employees, work on the basis of what member states mandate them to do, and we push, we do this, and so on and so on. So it's not either or. So we need to work collectively and work together, and there are different streams. So was I surprised? No, you will not be surprised by a lot of other things that happen in the continent. They are all the structural challenges, there are issues that we see happening. We can see that this may happen in this country and so on, but we probably need to improve how we respond. And whether the unconstitutional change of government, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that a popular uprising, I'm just saying that the point that I'm trying to make, I don't want to misunderstand, is that once we start saying you'll have an election, and maybe that election, there are problems with it, and you have a new government, and then you can then remove that government through the street. We are creating another problem for ourselves. You know, so that's really the point, that because then you are going to have an argument, then under what conditions the streets then, you know, it becomes a problem. So my view is that we really need to sort out some of the basics, and some of them are in that document, because once we start saying, if you lose an election and maybe the voter turnout was low, and maybe this person changed the constitution, maybe this person did this, but there was an election and the AU sent the election observer mission, Rex sent the election observer mission, they left there with their reports, and then they recognize the regime, but then the streets, they come, they remove. Once we work with that formula, we are going to have the recurrence of this problem, because then the question is going to, is 10%, is 5%. So I'm trying to say that we need to go back to the point that I think was raised by Adebayo and so on, and perhaps try to arm the regional institutions, if we are talking about the AU and the Rex in this case, to arm them and to empower them to be able to intervene in instances in a preventive way, to prevent member states from doing certain things, which currently, in the current legal arrangements, they fall within the sovereign domain of member states. But once we start having a blanket, giving countries a blank check, say, even if you have had an election, and then maybe there were problems with that election, then the streets can remove that person in power. I think then we are going to have a legitimacy crisis in a number of countries, because in many of our countries, the elections are not, they don't happen under the most ideal conditions. That's why when we were in one observer mission, and that's what I was going to, that's the point I'm going to end with now. When we went to one observer mission, election observer mission, we had a debate when we were doing our report. We said, are these elections free and fair? We couldn't agree. And then we said, what is free? We said free. Did we see free? We couldn't agree. We say fair. Did we see fair? Then we said, but are these elections an expression of the will of the people? Then we said yes. And then what is the expression of the will of the people? Voter turnout, no violence on days of elections, and we use the third defining this. And then and since we did that statement, I see there's the trend with elections in Africa. A lot of election observer mission, they stay away from free and fair. They use legitimate expression of the will of the people. Because when you are there and dealing with an election and you have to pronounce on its legitimacy, remember, the worst thing you want to leave when you live there as an election observer is to leave an illegitimate regime. Illegitimate regime that is not recognized by international actors, it's another, you just leaving behind a recipe for another crisis. Because once a regime is not recognized, that regime can legitimately be removed through the streets. So this is a dilemma. So we have moved away, we avoid free and fair because of the reality of our continent. And once we start saying, if you lose an election and it was rigged, whatever it was, then you can remove it through the streets. I think we are creating another problem for ourselves. We have to find another way of dealing with it. It is an African problem. We do have this as a reality. Countries do change constitutions. Countries conduct elections, and many people are unhappy with the quality of those elections. But we need to see how we deal with that. There's what we can do as regional bodies, but we're quite limited. And it's something that I made some suggestions at the beginning of during my presentation, as to how, as regional bodies, we can try to improve our regional jurisprudence and quite a number of things that we have in place to be able to make it difficult for certain things to happen on the continent. But we're at the crossroad. Remember, we are in 1999 Algiers. We'll find a solution to these problems in the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Maloka. you'd like us to wait 10 years, but I'm not sure if the youth are going to be willing to do that. But I see Dr. Solomon was very exercised as you were speaking. I don't know, Solomon, if you want to say something very quickly before I turn it over to Professor Olukoshi. Solomon?
No, I find that creativity of the election observation mission trying to make a very interesting distinction between free, fair, credible elections and elections that actually manifest the will of the people or the electorate. I don't know how we square moving away from free, fair, credible, and then say, but it is still an expression of the will of the public. And then after those elections, such as, for example, the one that happened in Guinea in October 2020, less than a year now, which was described as such, as manifesting the will of the electorate. And here we are. So I don't know if moving away from the youth of free, fair, credible elections is helpful on its own. Actually, if anything, later on when we encounter the collapse of the government, as we have witnessed in Guinea, then we don't see a situation in which, for example, the AU or ECOWAS saying, let's have the previous government back to power. We haven't seen them saying that, right? Which itself is indicative enough. What they are saying is basically, okay, let's bring the military out of politics. And we do so not by returning to the old or to the status quo ante, but by establishing a transitional process. All right, which seems to suggest that yes, we were not in agreement with what happened in Guinea. Basically saying the election was not free, credible, and fair. So perhaps I think, but the contradictions that you pointed out, Prof. Maloka, is extremely an important one, where you have the kind of challenge that Prof. Olukoshi highlighted, which is the divide or the disconnect between the expectations of the public and what governments actually deliver, leading to a crisis of legitimacy and credibility on the part of government. Obviously, you are going to face a very serious problem, even when the democratic process might have made the procedural requirements, because the social and economic dimension of things remains unmade. Of course, that doesn't mean that changing government would result in bringing about the expectations of the public, which can only come about by the kind of problematization that I would say Prof. Bayo had highlighted. So thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
and
I have to run, Madam Chair, you'll excuse me. Yes. I just wanted to say, when I was saying 10 years, I'm not saying we wait 10 years. I'm saying that there was a stage we didn't have all these things. We didn't have unconstitutional, we didn't have justice, we didn't have this peace and security concern, but we now have them. So what are the point I'm trying to make is that it is possible in the next 10 years, if we, like with this meeting, we should continue to work and solve, because these are problems that we have to solve ourselves as a community. That's all I was saying. I wasn't saying the youth must wait for 10 years. My apology, my sister, I have to run in there. So please, Bayo, my friend, we'll talk offline. I'll call you. And sorry, I have to run to another meeting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, Eddie. Bye.
Prof. Olukoshi, there's a question in the chat from Guy Alain Ramazani, who has also reminded us that these forums should be held in more than one language other than English. And Guy, I think that the organizers have taken that into consideration. But his question is in the case of unconstitutional changes of government, where is the place of the youth? He's also wondering why the African Union does not, kick out or expel member states concerned. But I think just his question around the youth, and Prof, you touched on young people, you touched on the people of the future, the issues of the future, their connectedness to global events, and also what they represent and their sense of alienation from the status quo. But I also want to link this to, you said, your exact words were how even in cases of alternating power, whether it's the opposition or an incumbent, there is this deliberate effort to wrong foot the citizen in terms of the options that citizens have. So, Prof, if you could just say a little bit more about this as we are drawing to the close of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me first of all note that the conditions that make it possible for the kinds of changes in the leadership of our countries that we've seen taking place in several places and threatening to do so in others is itself reflective of the foreclosure increasingly of other channels that could be described as constitutional. I talked about the winner-take-all mentality, regaining strength in corridors of power. The whole idea of democracy, and this is classic liberal democratic theory, is the assumption that for the opposition to be a loyal opposition, it must have, and indeed even be supported, to have the capacity to live and fight for another day, right? It's not an abstract loyalty. It's not a one-way loyalty. There is a reciprocal component to it, in which, as winner, you exercise, of course, you enjoy the fullness of your victory, but you are also enlightened in the exercise of that victory, not to pursue a zero-sum approach in which you use the advantage of your incumbency to effectively cripple every opposition. And that's what we've been seeing in many of our countries. So from the early days when, Benin Republic, Ghana, we saw, very exciting examples of incumbents losing and living gracefully, and their successors coming in and giving them the respect that is due to them as former heads of state and so on and so forth. And intolerance, that is, so that you bring yourself to the situation of a Patrice Talon who can preside over a Benin, where 2 or 3 former heads of state have been tear-gassed on the streets of Cotonou for coming to protest at a unilateral amendment of the constitution. You foreclose constitutional avenues for making change happen. Leave aside former leaders and take the citizenry. Across our continent, civil society spaces are being closed. They are being closed. So what are you telling the people? You speak out, even call a press conference, you are hauled in and called a terrorist. And terrorism laws, if you are not hauled in and called a terrorist, you are charged for treason. And I think there is ample space for existing institutional mechanisms to actually monitor this. I mean, it's the part of the reason why the peer review mechanism was set up. And yes, there is sovereignty. But excuse me, we also said that this African Union was founded on a doctrine of non-indifference. So why would we, begin to hide behind the screen of sovereignty, it's our internal affairs and all of that, and more so coming from leaders like Conde, who are themselves frontline. I mean, Conde, at least for a period, was part of the top 5 with the late Idris Deby, Kagame, who are basically driving the AU. And all of a sudden, and the AU reforms, you become, you know, a bulwark of everything that is, you know, against what you have been pushing at the continental level. So I think it's important that we also anchor at that level, that there is, it may be that on aggregate, we have come some way from the days of Idi Amin, where we are today. It may be that we have come some way, but dictatorships also evolve. They don't stay as crude as they were during the days of Idi Amin. They are more subtle, they are more intelligent. They do direct or indirect comparison of notes across boundaries, you know, on what works and what doesn't work. But what we have is a shortage of the Yereres who might be able, across boundaries, or in Mandela's, across boundaries, to say, hey, you are out of order. You need to do a reset here. Otherwise, you are going to risk everything that we fought for collectively and the fruits of which you are enjoying as president. So there is room for something to be done. It's just not being done. And there's the whole business of observation. I think the least one can say is that it has so discredited itself that everybody now agrees that there is a case for going back to the drawing board. And I've always believed that empowered citizens are easily the best observers of any political process. Empower the citizenry, and the role of the observer becomes really purely academic. Disempower citizens, and if you do not have effective external observers to fill the gap that arises from the disempowerment of citizens, then you begin to have grammatical somersaults about what happens and what does not happen in an election. Until you get a slap from the Supreme Court, as we are seeing, when we talk about the increasing judicialization of many of our so-called democratic processes, in which in some instances, even 2 years after an incumbent has been in power, a court rules to say that you've been sitting there illegally, you didn't win that election. And the whole political system is put in turmoil. Which also, I think, speaks to the question of leadership and the youth. Because I think you cannot build an enduring democratic system, number one, if you do not have leaders who are themselves invested in the ideal of democracy. And secondly, who take deliberate steps to ensure the continuity and advancement of the system that propels them into power. That also, by definition, will include organizing effective transitions in leadership, effective leadership transitions to take place. Now, look at Central Africa region of our continent. People who can barely walk, they are there still insisting that they are the only ones who can rule. Right? They are insisting they are the only ones who can rule, and there's nothing anybody else can do about it. And when people then begin a rebellion of one kind or the other, you appeal to your peers to say, we have a problem here. It's an attempt to break up the country, when in fact you've already broken up the country by your own behavior. So leadership is as important in this context, and leadership that is invested in a long-term vision of transformation that includes the transformation of the political arena. So when we talk also of change in our countries, let's not forget that there is that intergenerational succession that must take place. And it will take place, whether we like it or not. It will take place in one form or the other. Enlightened leadership will try to plan for it. Unenlightened leadership will cling onto power until it is disgraced out of office. And there is no regime that will not decay, no matter how long it stays in. And the wrong footing that I refer to is precisely all of those maneuverings that take place in the system, which we see manifested in different shapes and forms on our continent by the ruling elite, basically with one goal in mind: preserve power and do whatever is necessary to disorganize, to fragment, to repress, and disempower the bulk of the people. Now, I don't know. We always say that maybe because we haven't tasted what is fed to people in the State House, so we don't fully grasp this issue. But I would imagine, colleagues, that part of my own sense of pride and dignity as the leader of any country will be my ability to thump my chest and say that I represent the people. When you rig an election and then you head to the United Nations or wherever and start talking, I mean, really, half of the people in the room know you rigged. The media have absolutely no respect for you because they've read up and saw that you rigged. I mean, so what are we talking about here? And I think these are the kinds of investments which we also need to make in leadership. There is room for dialogue, and I welcome the proposals by Amani that, you know, there might be things we can dialogue about, but there's also, I think, important work to be done domestically in most of our countries, where the youth need to organize, especially for those of the youth who believe in a democratic transition. To organize, it will not come without costs. It will not come without costs, but it has to be tenacious, it has to be unified, and it has to be determined that change will come. And hopefully, Nkrumah did it with the Veranda Boys. Nobody gave him any chance, but he managed to organize the déclassé and form a formidable movement that inevitably led to independence of Ghana. And we've seen it repeated at different instances of liberation, that it is possible for the youth to organize and overcome the adversity and the pain of repression in order to be able to drive some of the change which we want to see. That's where my hope lies. But otherwise, for what we see in West Africa and parts of Central Africa, it takes one religious zealot to propose an alternative vision of society, and less than $5 to recruit young men and women who have lost faith in secular authority that has failed them repeatedly and are determined that they will be part of a battalion that will create a new El Dorado that is anchored in a peculiar version of faith and the afterworld. That's what is driving Boko Haram. That's what is driving Islamic State in the Maghreb, and so on and so forth. That's social dislocation. And it has to be also combated, because it is not the kind of vision of society which we want to see for ourselves, for our continent. But it is one which will spread if the enlightened youth organization that I talk about does not happen, to begin to push an agenda that is secular and that is forward-looking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Wow, I don't even know how we we begin to unpack all of this, Solomon and Zion. But I think we've come to the end of our time, so I wouldn't, and we've lost quite a lot of people, I'm sure, that have moved on to other meetings this morning. So perhaps, Zion, if you could just offer us just a final thought, maybe just take a minute or two, and then I'll ask Solomon to also give us some closing remarks. Zion, over to you.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Shuvay. So yeah, basically, I think most of the issues have been explored very exhaustively by all of our speakers. And as the report also clarified, exemplifying, of course, Guinea, but then we have seen the repeated cases in Mali and Chad, and also very recently the attempt in Sudan, that there is a clear manifestation of resurgence of coups all over the continent. So there is a clear need to address not only the norms and the gaps in their implementations, which we identified, but also trying to look into these very underlying causes, like why are we headed in that direction? Why do we have this popular support for these events? I think it's very important to deeply examine and address our governance issues before we even look into the norms that AU has set. This is what I would like to personally stress. Maybe I'll hand over to Dr. Solomon so that he can give us our final concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zion. Solomon?
Thank you so much to Prof. Bayo for that very profoundly powerful analysis of the state of our continent and the challenge that we need to confront and how we need to do that. And indeed, I think the scale of the crisis that we face, and of course, if we put this in the global context and how Africa is shaped and affected by the global state of governance, including the experience of SAPS in the 80s, and indeed the problem of policy space that African states face. I think there is a lot to digest and process in terms of us thinking about why we are witnessing resurgence of unconstitutional change of government. As Prof. Maloka indicated, this may be the second, if not actually third or fourth cycle of resurgence. There were previous instances of resurgence of unconstitutional change of government. From my side, all that I would like to say after such a very profound and rich insights that have been shared and responses to the questions raised is not to dilute what has been said, and therefore simply say thank you very much to our speakers, distinguished speakers, Prof. Eddie Maloka, CEO of the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, to Prof. Adebayo Olukoshi, a distinguished professor at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and also to you, Shuvay Nyoni, Executive Director of the Africa Center, the Africa Leadership Center. Thank you so much for ably moderating and steering our deliberations. To my colleague Dion for a very excellent presentation of the summary of the special report that we have launched during this seminar. Last but not least, but perhaps most importantly, thank you to all of you who joined us for this webinar on the pressing and topical issue of what the resurgence of military coups and unconstitutional change of government tell us, and what we need to do about them. I would like to express Amani Africa's gratitude and appreciation to all our partners, members of the Peace and Security Council, the African Union Commission, and most importantly, our funders, the Embassy of Germany, the Embassy of Switzerland, the Embassy of Ireland. We thank you very much for all the support that you provide us, and we look forward to our continuing partnership. Thank you all very much. I think this brings us to the end of today's seminar. I look forward to our next webinar, during which we have taken note of the recommendation on the need for having translation. We will implement that proposal. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and goodbye. We will meet again when we have the next forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Prof.